Wonderful. Welcome back, everyone. Maimonides' Life and Legacy, our fourth session tonight, and our last is dedicated to Maimonides' ethical theory and his number of aspects of his ethical thought, and really very, I think, understudied aspect of his legacy. And I wanted to end on it in particular to give us a broader perspective on Maimonides' legacy. And hopefully we'll see why as we go through, especially towards the latter parts of tonight's class. We left off last time in our journey through Maimonides' legacy with this comment that he makes in the preface to his 8 chapters. Now, you may recall that the 8 chapters is considered one of his ethical masterpieces. It's been called by at least one Jewish studies scholar the best introduction to Maimonidean philosophy. And to a great extent, it kind of encompasses a great deal of Maimonides' thought in 8 short chapters, although the 4th and the 8th are pretty long, but relatively speaking, 8 short chapters. But he also writes this preface to the 8 chapters. Of course, the 8 chapters themselves are an introduction to his commentary on Masechet Avot, on Mishnah Avot. But in addition to that, the 8 chapter introduction, he writes a preface in which he urges his Jewish readers to be aware of the fact that his sources are not exclusively Jewish, and not to be afraid to learn from non-Jewish wisdom. And he makes this famous comment in Arabic, right? Isma' al-haq, heed the truth from whoever says it, from whatever the source, no matter who says it, heed the truth, listen to the truth. Words that we all could learn to live by today when we hear things that if they come from someone we don't like to listen to it. We could really learn from Maimonides in this regard. But I really wanted to remind us of this idea at the outset, because it's not accidental that he makes this point in his 8 chapters, in the preface to his 8 chapters, even though he makes this point actually in a few different places in his work, in his various works. But the fact that he makes it in the preface to this particular work is significant, because for those who look carefully into his 8 chapters, again, is kind of the centerpiece of his ethical thought. And the more you look at it, the more you see a reflection of the thought world, including the ethical thought world of those who preceded him and who were his contemporaries. So, and both again from the ancient Greeks into his contemporary kind of Arabic milieu. So Maimonides lives up to his advice to heed the truth, and I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey tonight to give you a sense of perspective on how he does this indirectly, without citing his sources, as he really never does. He opens you up to a world of ideas that is not exclusively Jewish, but at the end of the day creates a tapestry that ends up being something novel and Jewish, where we never imagined, right, Judaism could take us before. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see the direction we're going tonight. You can follow along with our handout. Okay, here we go. Maimonides is the champion of virtue ethics. Okay, and if you're not entirely sure what virtue ethics means, don't worry. As you can see in Roman numeral 2, we will discuss that very soon. We're going to start by thinking about this question that got raised last time. Somebody was curious about the relationship between let's say the ideal of philosophy versus ethics. And I spoke a little bit about this last time, but I really wanted to start with that idea here because we're jumping into ethics after we discussed his philosophy. And then, of course, so we'll look at the specific nature of the ethics that he teaches here, this idea of virtue ethics. We'll talk about that in relation to something we often think of when we talk about ethics, namely good deeds, and how the two are related and how they're not related. Number 3, right, that we're going to be looking at this sort of centerpiece of his virtue ethics, this concept of the middle way, often known as the kind of the golden mean, the shvil zahav in Hebrew, and then of course the extremes on either ends of that middle way, and what that might mean in Maimonides' case, and it's not as straightforward as we might think. And then at the very end, I want to touch on an aspect of this of Maimonides' ethics that is really crucial in my mind, and I'm actually looking up right now in an article this aspect of the theme of therapy with respect to the sick soul, and how Maimonides draws upon earlier thinkers to create his own particular worldview there. All right, so that's where we're going tonight. And hopefully, as before, we'll pause a few different times, in at least 1 or 2 times throughout before we proceed, in order to take some questions and some thoughts from you. So I'll go through the first 2 of these, and then we'll take a break to hear from you. So if you do have questions, please throw them into the chat box, or hold on to them and ask them when we get there. We will only have time probably for 2 or 3 questions at that point. So just if you have them, make sure you jot them down right away so we can hopefully get your answers to your questions. Okay, excellent. So ethical and intellectual perfection. If you recall, I alluded to this passage in the guide last time that refers to this interpretation that Maimonides gave to Jacob's ladder. Right, Jacob's ladder for Maimonides. This was, of course, it was a prophetic vision that he has, that it was very much emblematic for Maimonides of the prophetic journey. As far as Maimonides was concerned, the ascent and descent of the angels was in fact the ascent of the intelligence of the prophets, right, up into the celestial realms, and the kind of connection to the divine truths. But then, of course, for Maimonides, is a crucial element of that story is the descent back into the world, and taking the truths back into earthly reality and circumstances. So I wanted to begin with this perspective, this question of ethical and intellectual perfection, and to see how the 2 relate to one another. Because the fact of the matter is that they pertained, as far as Maimonides was concerned, to 2 vastly different realms. I'm going to take you into a couple of different sources to try to kind of bring home this point. One is from Maimonides' earliest source, actually, that is hardly ever studied, his treatise on logic, and the other one, as we'll see, will be from early on in the guide. All right, and we'll see how he connects, or how I should say, what we often refer to as ethics. How it connects or how it relates to the intellectual life. So he says here in the 8th chapter of his treatise on logic, those premises that are established and require no proof as to their veracity fall into 4 categories. Okay, so things that you don't need to prove, they just are obvious. Number 1, things perceived by the senses. Okay, such as our knowledge that something is black or sweet or hot. Okay. Number 2, fundamental axioms. He gives us an example, such as our knowledge that the whole is greater than a part. We don't need to prove that this is the case. It is self-evident. These are axioms, fundamental principles. Okay. Number 3, conventional judgments. And here I provide the Arabic mashurat and the Hebrew mufussamot, because this is the kind of the terms and the history of these ideas. As Harry Wolfson, the famous early professor at Harvard, once said, he was one of the earliest Jewish studies professors in this country. He said that ideas ride on the back of terms. And to really appreciate the ideas, you really need to understand the terms in which they're packaged. And so this idea, we'll talk more about this concept momentarily, but he gives an example here, such as our knowledge that exposing one's nakedness is unseemly, or that rewarding a benefactor with gifts is admirable. Okay. We'll come back to that one momentarily. Then the fourth example is received facts from a trustworthy source. This may not be obvious to you, but this was actually one of the arguments that was made in the Islamic world, and that Jewish philosophers, theologians, starting with Sadi Gaon, actually picked up on, and was one of their arguments in favor of the oral tradition, that ideas that are passed on by an entire group from generation to generation are reliable. The same way we rely on facts that are passed down to us that we may not realize the source for which we may not know. well, we trust the sources, right? So we might trust an historian. We trust some sort of a source, even if we don't know exactly where it comes from. Okay, now to come back to number 3, conventional judgments. So this is literally what the word means, mashhur, okay? It means something which is famous or well-known. That's why we have this concept of mifusam in Hebrew. That's the literal translation. But notice that the examples refer to things that we ought to do or ought not to do. Good things to do, right? Bad things to do. But they're referred to as conventional judgments, these things which are well known. It's a very odd idea from our perspective, but what it captures is this idea of that in modern times, people often refer to as ethical relativism, even though it's not exactly where he's going, and we'll see why soon, but it sounds a lot like ethical relativism. In other words, things which are obvious in one culture may not be obvious in another culture, right? Some cultures are more clothed than others, for example, okay? And let's see how he just follows this up with the following paragraph. As for conventional judgments, they vary and differ from one another, for there are judgments which are generally accepted among one people and not generally accepted, mashurat, among other people. And then he says, and that which is generally acceptable among many groups of people has a greater degree of approbation. Not necessarily truth value, but approbation. Okay, it's a subtle difference. But it's one that's very important for Maimonides because it's a very important distinction that he draws between 2 different binaries. Number 1 is the true false binary. Okay, things which we can discern to be true or false based on our logical reasoning or other factors. Number 2 is the good-bad binary. Good and bad is not the same as true and false. Even though we sometimes overlap the concepts unthinkingly, good and bad, we don't necessarily, when we say something is good, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. It means that it's accepted to be good, all right? And vice versa, something is accepted to be bad, whether or not it's true or not, okay? So we want to just keep that in mind as we go forward, this important distinction. Now, Maimonides picks up on this idea in one of his later works, in the Guide of the Perplexed, where he actually, he does this by interpreting the famous story of the Garden of Eden and the choice of Adam and Eve to basically go against the divine mandate and to go toward what they perceive to be delectable in their eyes. Now, this becomes the opportunity for Maimonides to pick up on some details of the story. The fact that after Adam and Eve eat of the tree of knowledge, what is it that they notice? Right? What's the first thing that they notice? They notice that they're naked. Right? Notice one of the examples that Maimonides gives here for conventional judgments, exposing one's nakedness. This is one of those things which is well known, but it's not known because it's true or false. It's known because it's accepted. There's a certain kind of realm of thinking in terms of what is good or bad, which is separate from that which is true and false. And he tries to explain this in this passage from the Guide of the Perplexed. What does he say here? He says, the intellect that God causes to overflow in people, that is to say, our intellectual perception, and that constitutes a person's ultimate perfection. Now, this takes us back to last week's or 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, the class, we looked at his philosophical concept of the ultimate aim of any given thing is what makes it unique. The ultimate purpose of something is what makes it unique. So the ultimate purpose of the human being is that which makes us unique, namely our intellect, our rational faculty. So that is our ultimate perfection. And so the intellect which God overflows into us, okay, from the celestial intellect, and which constitutes our ultimate perfection as human beings, was that with which Adam was endowed before he disobeyed. Okay, here he means Adam and Eve, but he's just putting this in male terms, with which Adam was endowed before he disobeyed. Before eating of the tree of knowledge, he was connected to the realm of truth and falsehood. How do we know this? Because as he goes on to say, right, it wasn't the first time that God sort of communicated with Adam. On account of his intellect, Adam is said to have been created in our image and likeness. So Maimonides, he picks up on this theme he talks about in the very first chapter, right before this, of the guide, where he says that he interprets our image and likeness in Genesis 1 to be the divine intellect. Okay, that human beings have intellect, and therefore they are like God. So it's on account of this, the intellect, that the human being was said to be in God's image. But then he also says, and it's also on account of this intellect, that he was addressed and commanded by God. Okay, in other words, there's no idea in Maimonidean philosophy that someone can be approached by God, can be commanded or spoken to by God in any way that's not through the medium of the mind. You can't receive God's word unless you've already perfected the intellect to be able to be a kind of receptacle for divine wisdom. So in other words, Adam, just by the fact that he received God's message previously, had already been connected intellectually to divine truths. Right? Otherwise, he could never have received a divine command in the first place. So in other words, we know that the pre-tree of knowledge Adam was the true and false, right, mind Adam. And what happens after, right, after the eating of the tree of knowledge? He says, let's skip the next sentence, for divine commandments are not given to animals, and so on. Through the intellect, one distinguishes between truth and falsehood. And then he says, right and wrong, on the other hand, belong to the category of conventional judgments. Notice again that phrase, conventional judgments, takes us back to the treatise on logic, not those apprehended by the intellect. I really kind of just cut out a lot from this passage, but what he's saying here is that after disobeying the divine mandate, he basically had disregarded the mandate of the intellect and took a detour into the realm of what is considered to be right or good and bad. Okay, and that he, in a sense, constitutes, from Maimonides, Adam's fall. Right, we talk about the fall from grace in Christian theology. This is as close as we get in Jewish theology. The Maimonidean notion of the fall from the realm of truth and falsehood to the realm of right and wrong, to the realm of good and bad. Okay. And so from this perspective, it seems like the intellectual realm is superior, okay? And it also seems like that ethics is purely relative, okay? However, I would argue that this perspective needs to be nuanced significantly by a couple of other parts of the Maimonidean kind of worldview. And I'm going to give you two examples to counterbalance these two. One of them is taken from the 8 chapters, okay? Where he references the book of Zechariah, love, truth, and peace, right? Okay, emet v'shalom ehavu, and then he explains. Understand, he says, that truth, okay, emet, refers to the intellectual virtues, which are true and unchanging. Okay, true and unchanging. Truths are not changeable, as opposed to, right, they're not conventional. And peace, he says, Shalom, refers to ethical virtues, by means of which peace will be established in the world. This is a very important concept. For Maimonides, we call them conventional judgments, but what this means is that the aim of these judgments is to determine what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do, toward what end? Toward the establishment of social harmony, of world peace, of people getting along with one another. All right, that is the purpose of the ethical virtues, the purpose of what we call ethics, interpersonal relations, certainly, but the larger concept of ethics is all oriented toward peace in the world, okay, social well-being. But that's different from intellectual virtues. We can prove what is false and what is true. We can't prove necessarily what is right and wrong. We can make certain arguments. Ultimately, our arguments are proven by their effectiveness, whether or not they lead to social harmony, and whether or not they lead to the well-being of communities and families and relationships. All right, so that's number one, is that it's not totally random, it's not totally relative. Even though it's within the realm of relativity, it's still very much, there's a purpose here, and the purpose is peace. Okay, the second passage to counterbalance that perspective is taken again from the guide, actually from the very last chapter of the guide, 354. Okay, and let's get into this one. This is actually really a very important perspective with which Maimonides ends the entire book. So he's actually referencing here a verse from Jeremiah 9:23. But in this only should one glory. One should not glory in one's wealth and in one's fame. In what should one boast or glory, so to speak? Right, one isn't boasting, but what do we value the most? By coming to know me. For I, God, act with kindness, justice, and righteousness in the world. Okay. It is these that I desire, declares the Lord. That is to say, kindness, justice, and righteousness. So notice the two parts of this verse: coming to know me and acting with kindness, justice, and righteousness. Knowledge, what is true and false, and ethical, right, ideals. So what does Maimonides say? In other words, God says that my purpose is that you should be a source of kindness, justice, and righteousness in the world, as I have explained with regard to the 13 attributes. And this takes us back to part 1, chapter 54 of the guide, where he explains with regard to 30 attributes, basically saying that the same way that we speak of God, right, acting mercifully or charitably, we have to adopt the same way of living, the same mode of life. That everything we do is motivated by that way of life. That is our aim, okay, to live kindly, justly, and with righteousness. Therefore, he says, the aim of this verse is as follows. It's clear that human perfection, in which one may be truly glorified, is the one acquired by one who has achieved apprehension of God to the extent that one is able. In other words, intellectual attainment, the highest of which is intellectual attainment of God. However, he says, the way of life of such a person, after having attained this apprehension, will always aim toward kindness, justice, and righteousness, in keeping with divine actions. So the very end of the guide, right? The guide begins by affirming the supremacy of reason, supremacy of the intellect. But it ends by reminding us that the way of life of a person who has attained this intellectual, right, realization is then to live a life that is oriented around kindness and justice and righteousness. So is it true that the intellectual perfection is the ultimate perfection for a human being? Yes, because in Aristotelian terms, that is what defines me as a human being. Without being dependent upon any other human being, I, as a creature, right, have to find my realization in myself somehow, and that is through my intellect. However, we're not solitary creatures, and ultimately that intellectual attainment leads us back into the world, into again, love, truth, and peace. So this is two different perspectives of Maimonides, but each one hopefully balancing out the other, okay, on this issue of ethical intellectual attainment or perfection. All right, I want to do one more little topic with you before we stop for questions, and this is this relationship between virtue ethics and good deeds. Okay, so virtue ethics. So typically, again, when we think about ethics, we think about interpersonal relationships. We think about how we interact with one another, the kinds of things that hurt each other, the kinds of things that uplift one another, or that are kind to one another. And so, in other words, typically how we think about this is that it's the deeds that define who we are in relationship to each other. However, way back in Greek antiquity, Aristotle already began to rethink this concept of ethics in terms of character, that actions flow from the kind of person we fundamentally are, right? But from Aristotle, there's an intricate connection between action and disposition, right? In other words, we act a certain way because we're disposed to act a certain way. And how do we become disposed to act a certain way? Because of our actions. But what that does for Aristotle is it's an opportunity for him to reflect on ideal dispositions, or what we might call virtues, that are the focal point of his ethical work, the Nicomachean Ethics. All right, and so this is exactly kind of what is so interesting about Maimonides' ethics is that he has both, of course. In the Hilchot Deot, which is the place in his code of laws, Mishneh Torah, which is focused on what we might call ethics, or it's specifically on virtue ethics. It's not on the specific things that we ought to do to one another or for one another. But that doesn't mean that that's absent from the code. In fact, Maimonides, if you look almost towards the end of the code, he has the section in the Laws of Mourning, which is a whole list of teachings about how we ought to treat one another. And it begins because of it's kind of the context there is because it starts by talking about how we have to comfort the mourners, but that leads him into a discussion about all sorts of other things that we have to do for one another. And all of these things, he says, flow from the commandment of love your neighbor as yourself. So all those actions that we deem to be kind of the centerpiece of our ethics is actually placed by Maimonides in the Laws of Mourning towards the end of the code. Whereas it's in the beginning, in this section that's devoted to ethics, right, ostensibly, it's all about the dispositions. It's not about the actions. Okay, so, but it's not, again, it's not that one of them is there and the other one is not. They're separated by Maimonides, and they're separated intentionally. Maimonides thought very carefully about placement of different laws, and he separated these on purpose. He didn't want to focus on those actions in the context of his focus on dispositions. Okay, number 2 point here is that Maimonides also brought home this distinction in the very language that he used. So again, I've alluded to the fact that this laws of character traits is the translation for Hilchot Deot. And I want to highlight the language. Deot is not obvious as to what exactly it means. And I want to kind of explore that with you and again, what the contrast is in this particular case to other types of, let's say, ethical terms. So in one particular place in the 5th chapter of Hilchot Deot, he says as follows, and this is in the middle of this page here. He says, just as a wise person is recognized through his wisdom and his character traits, okay, through a person's deot, distinguishing himself from other people, so should he be recognized through his conduct, okay, ma'asav. So that there's a fundamental difference for Maimonides between those dispositions or traits, which he calls deot, and the actions, right, that flow from them that are ma'asim. Now, again, notice the fact that deot it's from the roots of knowledge, okay? And this is significant, not because, again, you now know that this has nothing to do with truth and falsehood. It has to do with good and bad, right and wrong. But why is it then traits that are sort of the mind, okay? And I think part of why he was attracted to this terminology is actually because of what we find in Mishnah Avot in the next little passage. This is way back in the actual, right, the Ethics of the Fathers, where it says that there are 4 types of human temperament or disposition. Arba midot b'deot. There are 4 categories of deot. And I'm translating it here, human temperament or disposition. Easy to anger, easy to appease. Number 2, slow to anger, difficult to appease. 3, slow to anger, easy to appease. And finally, easy to anger, difficult to appease. But these are different temperaments. Okay, they're not ideas, but they're nevertheless states of the mind, because in a sense, we act on the basis of the kinds of creatures that we become because of our ingrained ideas that are a result of our actions. So that it's not separable from the mind, but it's also not the same as the realm of ideas. It's kind of in between. But he hit upon this particular term because, again, he was writing in Rabbinic Hebrew, and he had a model for this in the Mishnah. Okay. So, but again, we see this distinction between actions and dispositions. Now, I want to highlight a particular aspect of what makes this emphasis on, or this relationship between actions and dispositions so important, so vital for Maimonides. And here I want to show you a passage from his commentary in the Mishnah from the 3rd chapter of Avot, where he basically is commenting on this famous phrase, Hakol lefi ha'maseh. In Pirkei Avot, it said, everything depends on the deed. So he tells us here that the virtues are not acquired according to the greatness of the deed itself, okay, what is done, but according to the number of good deeds. We don't acquire a virtue because we do something great, but by the amount of times we do something, okay? Not necessarily great, but by the fact that we do it. Now, I'll explain that, but more by what he says further. This is because the virtues are acquired by repetition. We might call it today habituation, okay, of the good deeds many times. Not when a person does one great deed, as this alone will not bring about a strong acquisition. And he gives us an example of someone who gives 1,000 gold coins, 1,000 dinars at one time to one man, right? Like a big generous gift, a big financial donation, right? You give like a capital campaign to a synagogue or something like that. But the trait of generosity, he says, is not going to be acquired by this one great act to the same extent as with someone who donates 1,000 times and gives each one of them out of generosity. And he says the same thing is true with the Torah. He says that the reward of one who redeems one captive with 100 dinars, right, is not like one who redeems 10, right, or 10 poor people, even with only 10 dinars. You do, it doesn't seem like it's as generous an act, but the more you do it, the more of an impact it has. And this is actually interesting because we, very often, sometimes it's helpful for us to think about which actually has the greater impact, right? If I had a choice of giving, let's say, I don't know, putting a dollar in the charity box, every morning, or giving $100 or $1,000 to a charity, which has the greater impact ultimately? Which has the greater impact? The truth of the matter is that they both have the greater impact, but in different ways, right? The $1,000 donation has a greater impact on the recipient, on the beneficiary, but the regular act of giving actually has a greater impact on us. It turns us into generous people by making us regular givers, even if it doesn't actually have the bigger philanthropic impact. It has the greater human impact on our dispositions as generous people. So for Maimonides, this is ultimately the number one goal of ethics is to perfect ourselves in order to effect change in the world. Okay. I'm going to stop here for a moment to take some thoughts and questions on your end. I'll stop the share momentarily and before we proceed. I see one person as wrote in the chat. Okay, so would Maimonides, Robert Like says, would Maimonides be likely to agree or disagree with the following two quotes? Number one, common sense may not be commonly shared. Okay, Clifford Geertz. Number two, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Okay, yes, so he certainly would, except that he, as far as he was concerned, the more common sense it is, the more likely it is that we're hitting the right mark, right? Because the more, again, this is Aristotelian, the more people seem to adhere to a given norm, the more it seems to be that its ultimate aim is one that is beneficial to society. At least we hope so. In terms of the second one, beauty's in the eyes of the beholder. Yes, although it's interesting that yes. So Maimonides, following it again in the Arabic language, the term for good is actually beautiful. Okay, Hasan, and the word for bad is unseemly or ugly, kabih. So it's interesting that this is itself derived from the Greeks, because the Arabs, in this sense, probably derived it from the Greek sources they were translating in those categories. You have the kalon and the kathon that are, again, good and bad, which is beautiful and ugly. So to say beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, it actually isn't. That's in the same category of conventional judgments. Second question or a thought: unless you know what they are doing with the money, you couldn't say. Okay. As to what is the benefit, the impact on the beneficiary. True enough. That's why we place our trust in just to a great extent, we place our trust that people are doing things ethically. Any other thoughts before we jump in to our second round? Anything else? If you do want to say something, just unmute yourself. Now we'll proceed. Oh, okay. All right. If you think of anything else, hold on to it or put it in the chat box, and we'll continue. Excellent. Okay. Good. So here we're going to be looking at the kind of the core of the Maimonidean doctrine of the middle way. Okay, the golden mean, and to see what exactly he does with this. Now here I want you to pay special attention to the different categories that Maimonides, let's say, attaches to this to the theory that he lays out for us. What kinds of categories of actions or ideals do we have? Is there more than one ideal? If so, how do we explain that? Right? Where might they come from, and which one takes precedence? So let's pay attention to those things as we go forward. All right. He starts off by saying in his Laws of Character Traits that every person has many character traits, each one different and distinct from the others. Okay. And he gives a couple of examples. He gives an example of anger. Some people are more prone to anger, some people less so. Then he gives an example of arrogance and humility. Now hold on to those examples because they're going to actually be very significant later on in some unexpected ways. Okay. But he starts off by kind of making a psychological insight or point that there is that we are not all the same, and so our approach to ethical virtues really needs to start with who we are. In order to affect change in ourselves, we need to really pay attention to who we are, what our dispositions are, and to study ourselves, to know ourselves, like the Delphic Oracle says, right? Know yourself. That's the first starting point. Okay, and then he says something right in the second halakha, which is the next one, 1-2. Between the extreme character traits, okay, there are intermediate traits. So in other words, between, let's say, anger on the one hand, or irascibility, in other words, like what's we say in Hebrew adush, forget the term in English is like where we're basically insensitive to things around us, where we're apathetic. That's the term. Okay, so one extreme, the other extreme, angry disposition versus apathy. Okay, we have arrogance on the one extreme, we have humility on the other extreme, and then we have something in between. Okay, so in 1-3, he then goes on and says that it's not proper or fitting for a person to behave in accordance with or adopt the two extremes of each character trait. In other words, in no way is it rationally kind of, could we conceive it to be proper? Can we make the argument that it's proper to behave with one extreme or the other? All right, and I repeat this because, again, we're going to see something later which is going to surprise us. So keep this in mind. If a person finds that his nature inclines toward one of these extremes, what should that person do? That person should bring himself back or herself back to what is proper and walk in the path of the upright. And what is the path of the upright? The derech yesharim, namely the straight path. The straight path is the middle way, okay, between the two extremes. So that is our golden standard. Always follow the middle way. Either extreme is always bad. Then he says, okay, the straight path is the midpoint of each character trait. Here in 1-4. Therefore, he says, the early sages instructed. And again, the sages here, who does that refer to? We want to say it refers to the rabbinic sages, but let's hold off on that temptation for a moment. He says the early sages instructed that a person should constantly evaluate his traits, directing them along the middle path. For example, a person should not be wrathful and easily angered, but a person should also not be unfeeling like the dead. Okay, that was the term I was looking for before, apathetic. Rather, one should adopt the middle way, only showing anger when the matter is serious enough to warrant it and to ensure that it doesn't happen again. This, he says, is the path of the wise. And this is the same word, by the way, for sages, chachamim. Path of the sages, the path of the wise. Okay, I said the early sages because it sounds like a rabbinic phrase. Okay, chachamim arishonim. But in the derech chachamim, the way of the wise, the path of the wise, it sounds like it's that we're talking about the rabbis of old. But it's not exactly the case. Notice, first of all, the example is the same one, the one that we saw before, anger. Okay, the same one that we started with. Now I want to show you an example of what an early sage by the name of Aristotle has to say on this topic. In his Nicomachean Ethics. He says, a man is praised for being angry under the right circumstances and with the right people, and also in the right manner, at the right time, and for the right length of time. Right? It's all about the proper amount, measure, right, of the particular kind of disposition. And he says the the deficiency in anger, whether it's a kind of apathy or whatever else it may be, right, is blameworthy. For those who do not show anger at things that ought to arouse anger are regarded as fools. Okay, this is Aristotle. But how different is that from what Maimonides had just said? Either extreme is bad. Okay, it's not fitting for a person to behave in accordance with either one of the other extremes. Rather, walk in the middle way. And what example does he give for the middle way? For example, a person should not be wrathful and easily angered, but a person should also not be unfeeling like the dead. Rather, one should adopt the middle way, showing anger when the matter is serious enough, okay, and warrants it. Well, this sounds awfully like a lot like this passage from Aristotle, where it really depends on, are you getting angry to the right extent, for the right reason, against the right people? Okay, there is a place for anger according to the Aristotelian ethics, and there's the right amount of anger. So it sounds like Maimonides is following Aristotelian advice, and that those early sages we thought were the rabbis at first actually are the ancient philosophers, because as we know, in medieval Jewish thoughts, the chachamim are not only rabbis, but also philosophers. And chokhmah is another term for science, knowledge, or philosophy. Okay. Now, this is where everything gets very, very tricky. So in the very next paragraph, Maimonides does a 180 on us. Okay. What does he say here? That's why I put Aristotle here to kind of give us a feeling like we know where we're going. Okay. We have a good feeling about where we're going here. And then what does he do? He throws everything up in the air. What does he say? A person whose traits follow the mean is called a sage, chacham. A person who carefully examines himself and deviates slightly from the mean to either side, to one side or the other, is called pious, chassid. We're told before it's not proper to go toward one of the other extremes. But now we're told that someone who examines himself and deviates is called a chassid. Now, Maimonides, remember, wrote this, the Mishneh Torah, he wrote this in Hebrew. This is his terminology. It's Hebrew original, it's not translation from any Arabic. And he gives an example. A person who shuns pride and turns to the other extreme and is exceedingly humble is called pious, following the quality of piety. The same applies to the other character traits. Now, remember, earlier on, he gives us examples of what is right. Notice here, different kinds of dispositions. One person is very arrogant, another person is very humble. So the humility is a kind of extreme. Notice here, he's saying that somebody who goes toward humility is pious. All right. now, but he actually adds here, and I'm sorry, you know what happened? Actually, now I'm remembering. I actually added a part of this that I forgot to save when the power went out in my house this afternoon, and I guess I forgot to add this back in when I forgot that I hadn't saved that. So basically, what he goes on to say. Let me just make sure that yeah, he goes on to say that that those who follow this path of piety, of going to one extreme or the other, are actually going beyond the letter of the law. And in the original, it's actually within the line of the law. Lifnim mishurat hadin. Maimonides here applies a rabbinic concept of going beyond what is strictly mandated to basically define piety. Beyond what is strictly mandated, what is mandated is the middle way. Okay, but going beyond it is the rabbinic way. So what are we doing here? What Maimonides is setting up for us is that the Aristotelian principles, the Aristotelian ethics, is where we would end up if all we had at our disposal was simply reasoning our way through. However, right, Maimonides is not only an Aristotelian. He also listens carefully to what the rabbis have to say, but he notices that the rabbis are not speaking with the same kind of advice as Aristotle, right? They praise humility in Avot chapter 4, right? Mishnah Daled, the famous words of Rabbi Levitas, me'od hevei shvar ruach. Be very, very humble. It's not following the middle way, but this is rabbinic advice, to be very, very humble. So what does Maimonides do? He says, well, there's the middle way, which is the scientific kind of logical approach of if you just kind of go with what provides for the best principle of moderation in society, go with the Aristotelian principle of the golden mean. But he doesn't leave it there. He inserts the rabbinic ideal of humility, and he calls this kind of deviation to one extreme piety. But then in the next chapter, he goes even further, okay? And he says here that there are some traits for which a person is forbidden to follow the middle way, when actually is supposed to move toward one extreme or the other. And guess which examples he gives? Surprise, surprise. One of these is arrogance. Okay, to follow the upright path is not enough to be merely humble. A person should be exceedingly humble. Moses is praised for being the most humble. What's another example? So too is anger, an exceptionally bad quality. What were those two examples he gave for kind of the Aristotelian dispositions, right? Anger and humility. It's not good to be purely apathetic, and it's not good to be too humble. One has to be in the middle way. But these are examples that for rabbinic piety, we're actually forbidden from following the middle way. The rabbis, in other words, Maimonides is hinting to us, is holding us to higher standards. It's not enough. It's not enough to simply go with the cold moderation principle. We actually have to hold ourselves to higher standards. But I think there's something else going on here too. And that is that Maimonides lights upon these two examples because these are two examples that for the rabbis were actually, they viewed these as kind of characteristic of denying God's existence. Notice he cites here from a rabbinic concept that they also taught, the rabbis taught, that whoever is arrogant has denied the existence of God. And he says the same thing, similar thing about, quoting from the rabbinic teaching about anger. The early sages said, and here the sages refer to the rabbis, not the philosophers, that anyone who becomes angry is like one who worships idols. So we have these two examples, these prime examples, which he used for the middle way. Now he's saying that the rabbis taught us that both of them lead us away from focusing on God. that if we are either exceedingly haughty or exceedingly angry, it leads us toward a focus on ourselves and away from God. So for both of these examples are really, really important for Maimonides. Okay, and he ends, of course, with this passage referring to Shabbat 88b, referring to those who accept the humiliation that others give them, and they don't act in kind. They don't respond in kind. They act with love, and they rejoice in suffering of them. Scripture says those that love God are like the sun when it comes out in strength. It passes straight out of the Talmud, Shabbat 88b. But again, this is now the Aristotelian ethics has now been kind of altered and modified by a higher rabbinic standard. Okay. Now, I promised you that I would also address this final question of therapy. I actually skipped over that here when we were going through the different the middle way versus the deviations. You notice I skipped from 1.5 to 2.3. Okay, and actually 2.1 and 2.2 is where he introduces the concept of therapy, of how we heal a broken soul. Now here, you have to remember that Maimonides was a physician of the body, okay, and utilized the model of therapy in different ways in his writings. I want to introduce you to how he does this in the case of ethical dispositions and why it really is so striking, why it's so interesting in this particular example. And again, as yet another symbol of the Maimonidean mosaic. So here we go back to 2.1 to 2.2, the parts that we skipped earlier. For those who are sick in body, he says, and by the way, this is paralleled in the 8 chapters in chapter 4. For those who are sick in body, bitter tastes sweet and sweet bitter. Likewise, those who have a sickness of the soul are drawn to and are fond of bad habits, things which they think something is good for them when it's really bad for them. Okay. What's the remedy, he says? What's the therapy for those who have a sickness of the soul? We tell the wrathful man to train himself to feel no reaction, even if he is beaten or cursed. Even if he is beaten or cursed. He should follow this path for a long time, he says. Ingrain and habituate this into his or her kind of psyche until the anger is uprooted from his heart. All right, we go to the opposite extreme. The remedy, the therapy for being too arrogant is to go to the opposite extreme, to be overly humble, right? As he says in the next paragraph, if one should train himself to endure much humiliation until arrogance is uprooted in his heart. But notice it's all for the purpose of going back ultimately to the middle way, which is the proper path. Because this is 2.1 and 2.2, and that's when he takes the turn in 2.3 to saying that there's some things which were forbidden to follow, in which were forbidden to follow the middle way. But in 2.1 and 2.2, this is where he sets up this idea that this is part of our therapy, is we want to end up with the middle way, but sometimes we need to deviate, right, to the opposite extreme in order to bring us back. Right. Now, what we kind of take all of this in mind, and we think back to the rabbinic ideals of staying with the ideal of humility or lack of anger, and we say, well, where does that leave us? Don't we want to come back to the middle way ultimately? Whereas Maimonides is saying here that it's actually forbidden for us to do so. What Maimonides is suggesting is that there's a therapy sort of for ordinary people, but there's another standard of therapy for those who want to adhere to a more saintly, a more pious way of life. And in that case, we actually need to apply the principle of therapy in our daily lives, and not to kind of just go to the opposite extreme in order to come back to the middle. But actually, there's sometimes when we need to live more along the line of one extreme or the other. Okay. I want to hear your thoughts and questions on this in a moment, but I do want to draw attention to the fact that the sickness in body and sickness in soul is something that Maimonides didn't invent whole cloth. All right, Maimonides actually was a very, very close reader of, again, the ancients and the moderns, the ancient Greeks and the modern Arab philosophers and physicians. And in this case, I want to show you an example from one of those ancient physicians. The figure was known as not the father of medicine, that's Hippocrates, right? But really the kind of head of the medical tradition until the early modern period. Okay, and this is Galen in The Art of Medicine. And he says something very, very important for Maimonides. He says the sign of greatest physical health is for a body to be proportionally balanced. Okay, in the Galenic medicine, there are different kinds of dispositions. We have or different temperaments. There's the hot temperament, there's the cold temperament, there's the dry temperament, there's the moist temperament, right? So those in their youth have more moisture and more heat, and those as they get older have more of a cold and dry temperament. Okay, and also this kind of pertains to different diseases for Galen. But what is true? And notice what he says here. It's not only about greatest physical health; it's also about healing and therapy. Next paragraph. One fundamental mode of healing is to introduce the opposite of that which is to be corrected. For hot dispositions, a cold cause is the opposite, and vice versa. For if everything ill proportioned is contrary to nature, everything moderate is in accord with nature. Then nature requires that everything immoderate be restored to moderation by something equally ill proportioned. You want to cool down some waters in a pot, right? It's boiling hot. You pour in some cold water, and it brings it back to a kind of moderate heat. Okay, you level it out. You moderate it by the opposite extreme. You don't put in warm water. You put in cold water to temper the hot water. Okay, the same thing is true for physical health. Now, Maimonides didn't stop there with the physical health, right? He pushes this concept forward to include spiritual or ethical health. Here he actually had a friend in a more recent Arabic thinker, that of Avicenna. He was a close reader of Avicenna, even though he never gives him credit. And Avicenna actually was the first one to apply the Galenic principle of the kind of this mode of healing to ethics, although he really doesn't. He just kind of mentions it along the way. He doesn't deal with it to great length. Maimonides picks up on this clearly, and he liked the idea, and he develops this into the cornerstone of his ethical theory. So I want to unshare here. I want to share. Basically, we started with this idea that Maimonides reminds his readers at the beginning of his ethical introduction, the 8 chapters, by talking about the importance of listening to the truth, right, no matter who says it and where it comes from. And he proceeds to create a mosaic of ethical ideas and principles, which draws from everyone from Aristotle, right, and Galen to Avicenna and Al-Farabi. I didn't even mention Al-Farabi, even though he's all over the place in the 8 chapters, and of course also biblical and rabbinic ideals. In the end, Maimonides has created for us a mosaic that is completely new and astonishing in its scope and in its and the kind of way of life that it appoints us to. But ultimately, he creates for us a new vision of a Jewish ethic, something which never existed before. It's not exactly Aristotelian, okay? It's not exactly rabbinic. It's not exactly Galenic. It's not exactly it's not exactly kind of biblical. It is a mosaic, and that is, in a sense, Maimonides' brilliance, his genius, was his ability to listen to the wisdom from wherever it came, to listen to Galen, to listen to Aristotle, to listen to the rabbis, and to fuse them into this beautiful synthesis, which is novel, and which after which Judaism was never to be the same again. So I want to leave you with a picture of Maimonides as an artist drawing from multiple sources and creating a picture which is completely new, even though, all right, there are familiar sources. And this is his genius. This is his great genius and his legacy to us, to learn from how to listen and how to create at the same time. I'd like to listen to hear from you. Have we see at least another one more comment or question? Let's see. Did Maimonides have a unitary concept of the soul, or did he believe that a particular soul amongst the different souls, was sick? So Maimonides deals with this actually in the first couple of chapters of the eight chapters, and he mentions the Aristotelian theory of the five. Excuse me, I'm sorry. He mentions the Platonic theory, which actually Galen liked, that of the three-part soul, and the natural, the appetitive, and the rational. He actually ends up rejecting that in favor of one that's more Aristotelian, the five-part soul, different parts of the soul. But actually, the way that he frames this is that there are only some parts of the soul, only some faculties. So this is sort of, he calls it, right, these are all five faculties of the soul, and only some of them can become. Can we talk about virtue or vice? Only some of them can become sick and can be healed. So in other words, those which are connected to our volition, to our choice. So in other words, the faculty of the appetitive faculty, right? Things which we are attracted to or not attracted to, right? Is something that pertains to our choice, whereas our imaginative faculty is something which we don't choose. It's simply our minds are kind of working unconsciously, or subconsciously. They pull together things that we experienced or maybe just imagine, and we're not responsible for them. So certain faculties of the soul are things which are in our control and can become sick and can be treated therapeutically. Others are outside of our control and are not don't pertain. So they definitely had a very sophisticated concept of the soul, consisting of five faculties. Okay. Anyone else? Yes, David.
So the Talmud has this balance between Chachamim and Hasidim. So you have the focus is on the Chachamim, on the sages, but you do have characters like Chani Magel, Chanina ben Dosa. Is this the first treatment in Judaism of trying to deal with these two types of characters and find some balance?
So it's interesting, actually. Maimonides, he was very, very smart in his choice of a language. I mean, he realized that there were two different kinds of ideal characters in early rabbinic literature. The Chachamim are the ones who are always they are the masters of knowledge and tradition. But there also are these figures that circulate in Tanaitic literature that are called Chasidim Arishonim.
Right.
So those are the ones who go above and beyond the strict measure of what is expected. They're maximalists. They say, it's not enough for us just to pray. We want to devote some time before prayer and after prayer to focus ourselves, right, to get into the proper frame of mind, and then afterwards to kind of bring ourselves back into the world. So they go above and beyond. The same thing is true with their ethical practices and with their approach to purity, and so many different things. The Hasidim go above and beyond what is expected of them. So they became the perfect kind of category for Maimonides to think about what is expected and then what goes beyond. But both of them are kind of are heroes for our tradition. So he utilizes them very effectively that way. Yeah, great. Anybody else? Oh, yeah, please.
Maybe just a follow-up to that. I'm just thinking about last week's Parsha. Did he comment on the Nazir, and did the Nazir go too far in terms of that spectrum of Chachamim to Hasidim? The Nazarites just go way beyond the veil, beyond what the Hasidim did? I'm just curious about that.
So you may recall that there's a rabbinic debate Talmud in Ta'anit as to whether or not the Nazarite actually was a sinner or a saint. Right? Because it refers to him as kadosh, or right. It's also I mean, it could be a nazirah, female Nazirite, but just to use that in a specific language from the Torah, it says it could be kadosh, but it also says nefesh, that he has to bring an atonement for his sin. What's the sin? One opinion in the Talmud is that that the Nazirite basically denied himself things which were permitted to him. So by Maimonides, what does he do? He accepts both principles. He says that one pertains to the way of moderation, right? The derech chasidim, the chachamim, the way of the sages, whereas the other one pertains to the way of the saints. So he's both. It depends, but it really depends ultimately for Maimonides. It depends on his motivation. It depends on a person's motivation. If you are approaching the one of the other extremes because you believe that is the universally right thing to do, you're wrong, right? It is not the universally right thing to go to an extreme of any kind. However, if you are following this approach because you believe that therapeutically it's necessary for you to mend your soul, then it actually is it's praiseworthy. So it really kind of comes down to motivation. And in the case of the Jewish ideal, that the pious motivation becomes itself a kind of new norm, that we strive to become people that don't respond angrily, no matter what the provocation. That's the rabbinic ideal, and similarly that we remain humble in the face of all sorts of temptations to the contrary. Not that we kind of strive for just a kind of for a dispassionate assessment of our virtues. So it's that's the Jewish ideal. That's the rabbinic ideal, which is in itself a kind of therapeutic ideal. It's both and. It's both and. Yeah, excellent. I have time here, so if anybody wants to ask one last question or raise one last point, I'm happy to listen and respond. But again, I don't want to keep anybody who's would like to leave. I understand. Stanley, yes, go ahead.
My mother was a very moderate person in all things, and my brother-in-law would say about her that she took moderation to an extreme. Now that's funny, and but maybe true also. So how would you bring that phrase into what you've been talking about? Is it possible, or would the sages say you would take moderation to an extreme?
Yeah. Well, I think we see that in the case of his implicit rebuke of Aristotle. Is that in a sense, it's not enough just to say that some of the pious people veer away from that cold kind of scientific middle way. He actually says that for the Jewish people, we're forbidden from being overly moderate because we need to remember that we have a higher calling. We are called to be kedoshim. Kedoshim to you means be a little bit separate. Hold yourself to higher standards, and that takes. Sometimes it's difficult to do so, and it's not easy to follow the middle way, but it's easier to follow the middle way than to deprive ourselves of our pride or of our inclination to respond with indignation. A great deal of training and discipline.
May I just ask one question?
Yeah, please.
What bothered me is the separation between being knowing ethics and behaving ethically, and apparently they're two different characteristics. Did he assume that just because you know ethics you will act ethically? Because that's absolutely not true.
No.
So you have so how do you work those two characteristics?
Right. So that's the famous debate between Plato, and Aristotle. Plato talks about the idea of the good, and if we only knew what the good was, what justice was, what virtue was, we would learn to be good, just, virtuous people. Aristotle understood that our dispositions are such that we are inclined toward things often against our better judgment, that we may know we may know that another piece of chocolate cake may not be so good for me, but I want it anyway. And I could take that example and apply it to many different areas. So our knowledge of the good may not lead us to act that way. And that's where he takes in this concept of habituation, of training oneself to act in a certain way regularly in order to make it second nature. That's an idea that Maimonides picks up entirely. He makes that again a core part of his ethical theory. But it's not enough just to train ourselves in moderation. Again, but as far as he's concerned, it's not just about what you think. It becomes a kind of a part of our psyche. Ultimately, the more we train ourselves to act in a certain proportional way, the more it becomes it's sort of our minds. Our mind knows what the right thing to do is almost instinctively.
So he wanted us to acquire certain habits.
Correct.
That will be like ethical habits in a way.
Correct. Exactly. It's
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Beautiful. Yeah. Wonderful question. It's confusing though because the terminology of deot can lead you to think the other way. Maybe one last point, Stanley. Yes.
So since you're talking about treatment, therapy, healing, and so on, the approach seems to be that you have to do self-therapy, as it were, that you have to work on yourself in order to bring out the golden mean, or not too much of that. Did he talk at all about other methods like we have today, for example?
Yes.
Trying to achieve like some kind of character transformation, or to live a better life, as it were?
Yes, he advocated consulting with people that live a wise life and that can guide us toward better dispositions, to identify which dispositions are healthier for our souls, and to guide us in the way to acquire those dispositions ourselves. The same way, he says, we go to a physician to try to get our bodies back into balance. We are in need of guides, our therapists of the soul, which he identifies with wise people that understand not only the nature of the soul and its kind of temptations, but the kinds of ways that can help us get back in line with our best ideals. So it's very much the case. How to do that is how to help people get to that place. He's not so detailed on. That's a part we want more information about. I do certainly, but he doesn't provide that detail about what the wise person does in the therapy session. But but we can't just do it on our own. He says we need help.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Good.
Mm-hmm.
To all of you, this has been such a for me. My only regret is that we couldn't really have more of an organic conversation together and I guess get to know you. I hope that will not be the case next time around. God willing, we'll have a chance to learn together again and
in person. Let's hope.
In person, exactly. Where we have this opportunity to really make learning more interactive. I really want to thank you for your interest in this, and I'm so privileged to be your guide through Maimonides here. Please do feel free to reach out to me. A number of you have done this already, and I'm so happy that you have. Please continue to reach out to me, ask me questions, or just share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks to all of you for
Thank you.
And let me invite everybody, please feel free to unmute yourself. It'll be a little bit chaotic, but let's just all join in together and thanking Elisha for these fascinating 4 sessions. Thank you so much.
Very nice.
Yeshua.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.